it's wonderful to be back here. Thank you all for coming. The Asia Society has been a great part of my life. I've done many events here. In fact, the journey to this book began with my novel, Sea of Poppies, which was launched here by the late, great Jonathan Spence. And that was a really memorable moment in my life. So thank you very much, Rachel, for making this possible and for having me back. And thank you for that very generous introduction. And thank you, Ashri. Ashri is a very old friend. We go back a long, long way. And I did my first event for you back in '95. And thank you, Razia, for agreeing to do this. Razia, again, has been a friend since 2008. Of course, I used to hear her voice on NewsHour every morning when BBC could still be trusted. And then I actually met her in 2008 when she did a little program on the Sea of Poppies, and I remember wandering around the East India docks with her. So it's wonderful to have her in the city, really an addition to our lives, and thank you so much for agreeing to do this, Razia. So I'm going to run you through the background to this book because it's sort of easier that way and more interesting, I think. So I got interested in the subject of the opium trade through my book, Sea of Poppies, River of Smoke, and Flood of Fire, which ends in the first Opium War. So this is the opium poppy, Papaver somniferum. The opium poppy doesn't exist in the wild. It actually is a cultivar that developed with humans thousands of years ago. Some of the earliest varieties were found in Switzerland 6,000 years ago. So humans have been cultivating this amazing flower for a very long time, because opium is an absolutely miraculous medicinal substance. It's still in many of our just ordinary across-the-counter medications. For example, if any of you have ever taken Imodium or any other diarrhea medication, you've taken opium. If you've taken cough suppressants, you've taken opium. So really, opium is sort of indispensable a part of life in a sense. So, but opium is different from other kinds of psychoactive substances, in that most psychoactive substances known to man are what I call grassroots psychoactives, like, for example, hashish or psilocybin mushrooms or whatever, in the sense that you can just go out, into a forest or something and pick them up. And of course, human beings have been doing that forever. Opium is different because opium has to be processed. You can't just pick it up. You can't just pick up a poppy and use it as opium. It has to be processed. It has to be milked, and the latex has to be boiled down, and so on. So opium, unlike, say, for example, marijuana or whatever, it went through these periods when suddenly its propagation increased hugely. And usually behind this sort of its propagation lay certain political structures. In that sense, it was a bit like what you might call an opportunistic pathogen, in that it found social and political opportunities, and then it sort of began to create a wider and wider market for itself. So the first great leap that opium made was in the 13th and 14th centuries under the old Mongol Empire, because the Mongol courts started using opium as a recreational drug, and the successors to the Mongol courts also started doing this. So the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughals. So the Emperor Jahangir used opium quite a lot. Here you see ascetics preparing opium in India. But the next step for opium, the really big step that it took, was when the Europeans entered the Indian Ocean. And the crucial factor in this was the Dutch. The Dutch in the late 16th, early 17th century started using opium in their dealings with the sultanates of Southeast Asia. And in their empire in the Dutch East Indies, they used opium to create political monopoly, to create trade monopolies of various kinds. Now, so what happened then was that the British followed this pattern, but a little bit later. And the British had to follow this pattern because of another plant, which was tea. So tea became very, very important for the British Exchequer, beginning in the late 17th century, and then very much so in the 18th century, when the British were making a lot of the taxes on tea was the second largest source of revenue for Britain. I mean, it's kind of astonishing to think of, but so it was. So the British tea trade was the exclusive monopoly of the East India Company. But the problem for the British is that they had to pay for their tea, all of which came from China. They had to pay for it with silver because they didn't have anything that the Chinese wanted. So in this picture, as you can see, it's a representation of tea production. This is a similar picture by a British artist, William Daniel. These are Western merchants negotiating the price of tea in Guangzhou. So through much, as you'll see here, through much of the 18th and 19th centuries, the tax on tea accounted for nearly a tenth of Britain's revenues. So, it provided enormous sort of wealth for the British government. Now, the problem really is that beginning in the mid-18th century onwards, there wasn't that much silver circulating anymore, because before that, there were these silver mines. Potosi was the best known in South America, which were placing an enormous quantity of silver on the international market. But then what happened is that this supply began to dry up, and the British had to find some other article, some other commodity to trade with, trade for tea. So because they had seen the Dutch growing the market for opium in Southeast Asia, they decided to do the same thing in relation to China. So in 1763, so this was essentially the same problem that the world faces in relation to China still. I mean, English exports to China were almost non-existent, because what were the Chinese going to do with, wool from Manchester or wherever? So they had to find something else. And actually, it's interesting, that same trade deficit that you see today existed way back then as well. So this is what the Qianlong Emperor said in a letter to King George III. He really had a turn of phrase, So anyway, in 1763, the British won the Battle of Buxar, and that's when they got control of this region in the Gangetic Plain. Now, opium production in India had previously been centered around Patna, the city of Patna, and that was where most of the opium was. Now, in 1763, as soon as the British gained control of this region, they declared a monopoly over opium. And they threw all other merchants out. They took it over. Within a few decades, they had created this very elaborate structure. Now, there were two big they set up a very big opium factory in the late 18th century in this town called Ghazipur. It was, at least then, a very pretty town, as you can see. And Ghazipur is a place where, associated with Lord Cornwallis. This is the same butcher Cornwallis who basically lost the American War of Independence. And of course, as always happens in the Anglosphere, he got kicked upwards and became Governor General of India. And where he became very active in organizing the whole opium industry. And that's where he lived, and that's where he died, and his tomb is in Ghazipur. And the Ghazipur opium, this is a plan of the Ghazipur opium factory. This guy, MacArthur, was the manager of the Ghazipur opium factory. He wrote a little book to encourage British tourists to visit the opium factory. And the opium factory still exists. It's the longest existing industrial enterprise in India and one of the oldest in Asia. It's produced incalculable wealth for Britain and for America, really. But the workers at the opium factory, they were just ordinary peasants, working away, and they got almost nothing out of it. And that's how it still is. I mean, this opium factory still exists, and as you can see, it's still just, local people who are extremely poor working there. The other big opium factory was in the city of Patna, and this is a plan of the opium factory at Patna. I love this particular picture, which was painted by a guy called Sita Ram. He was of the Patna school of, actually he was from the Murshidabad school of painters. And you'll see something very interesting here. Sita Ram has actually painted himself into the picture. That's him down there. It's literally a bird's eye view because, as you can see, he's painted in the curvature of the earth. But what's so interesting is that he's painted the Patna opium factory as though it were a Mughal palace or something. Again, here you see this opium go down, also by Sitaram. But he's painted all the mess and all the people out of it because he was producing these pictures for then Governor General, Lord Moira, who later became Lord Hastings. So there were many other, Sir Charles d'Oily, a well-known painter of the same time, was also an opium agent. That's another picture of his. Then later in 1851, this man, Captain Sherwill, who was a military surveyor, he produced these lithographs of the opium factory. And as you can see, he's again producing these pictures for an exhibition in London. So he wants it to look incredibly grand. And as you can see, he succeeded. I mean, this is like the Temple of Luxor or something, you would think, looking at it. But an Indian painter of the same period also made these paintings. This is Shivalal. And as you can see, Shivalal sees it in a completely different way. He's focused upon all the little people who are working there. But again, this is a picture by Sitaram, who did this picture of the opium go down. I love this picture because I think Sitaram very consciously wanted to put his picture into dialogue with Piranesi's The Round Tower, which I imagine he must have seen in some British home in Calcutta at the time. So the opium fleet would go down to Calcutta from Patna, and then from Patna it would then be auctioned in Calcutta. Actually, that's the building, quite appropriately, the HSBC Bank. That's the location. HSBC Bank was founded on opium, in fact, by opium traders, then it would be sent to China. And in Bengal, the opium enterprise grew incredibly fast, but at the same time, there was another center of opium production developing in Malwa. That also grew incredibly fast. So within a period of, basically 45 years, the amount of opium being sent to China is like a small tsunami. So the Chinese were very well aware of all the dangers, and they finally decided to clamp down on the opium trade. So the emperor sent a very famous Mandarin called Lin Jeju, who actually did clamp down on the opium trade. The British treated this as a casus belli, and that was when they launched the first Opium War, under which the Chinese were basically forced to continue to import opium. So I'll stop there, and now Razia and I will have a conversation. Thank you.
It's great to be here. Thank you very much, Rachel. Thank you, Shri. And thank you for that presentation, Amitav. So basically, this is a book about how the British Empire became a narco-state, how opium was used to pummel India, to corrupt China, and prop up the empire. That's basically it, right? Yes. Good, we can all go now. Let's go back to the beginning. It's great to have that context that you just gave us, but if we go back to the beginning in the book, your first musings about wanting to explain this hidden history comes from looking at the very ordinary things in your room, which were connected to your love of drinking tea and the things that you drank the tea in. So just explain a little bit about the kind of impulse of this.
Sure. Well, this is the great paradox. If you grow up in India, or for that matter, in Bangladesh or Pakistan or Sri Lanka, you never think about any sorts of cultural connections with China. Your cultural connections tend to be in the first instance with the West, and in the second place with the Middle East. That's where your linkages tend to be. You never really think of China. So I grew up in the state of West Bengal. You can actually see China from the state of West Bengal if you go far enough up. But China, I knew nothing about China, honestly. I'd never even wanted to travel to China until I started writing Sea of Poppies. But once I did go to China, and my first visit to China was in 2005, and basically I spent most of my time then in Guangzhou. And then one day I came back, to Calcutta, and I was sitting in my study, and I had this strange sort of epiphanic moment when I looked at my cup, and I thought, why? I'm drinking, we say cha in Bangla, and that's exactly the Cantonese word for tea, And then, there's some sugar sitting next to it, and that's chini, which literally means Chinese. And I looked around my room, and China was everywhere. The porcelain is Chinese, which we call in Bangla chine mati, meaning Chinese earth. Peanuts are called chine badam. So suddenly I had this extraordinary moment when I realized that, in fact, even though China was absent, as it were, from my mental geography, it was physically present everywhere in my life. And then when I came back to Brooklyn after that, I looked around my study in Brooklyn too, and that was even more the case, And it was an astonishing moment when I suddenly realized that the history that I had been taught, you tend to be taught history in terms of discursive concepts of various kinds. But if you actually look at the material realities that you inhabit as a human being, often they're completely different.
It's really interesting hearing you talk about the trilogy of novels that you wrote and how this interest in looking at the hidden history of opium came out of that. It seems to me also, though, that this is the third book in a trilogy of non-fiction, which is engaging with the world in quite a different way. Although this is also a hidden history of opium, it is something else as well, partly because you are so strongly determined to talk to us about the way in which opium is an actor, the poppy is an actor in this history in and of itself. Just explain what you mean by that, because it feels to me like that's what makes this book stand out among many things, but that is one of the things that makes it stand out.
Well, certainly this idea is not unique to me. There's an American diplomat and historian who first said, that poppy, if you look at the history of the poppy, you get the sense that this is an intelligent being. In as much as you can imagine intelligence in a plant, this plant has some kind of intelligence because it constantly outthinks every human effort to control it. Not only that, it creates these recurrent patterns, patterns in society, historical patterns, and we can come back to that if you like. But certainly the reason that I began to think about it particularly is because since 2016, I've been very engaged in writing nonfiction about the climate crisis and about, certain historical patterns that manifest themselves with the climate crisis. So I wrote a book, which uses the nutmeg as an analogy for what's happening in the world. And I think the more you look at those things, you suddenly do realize that the great and terrible error that human beings fell into, and they fell into this error in the 17th century, really at the beginning of the Enlightenment, when Descartes and Francis Bacon and everyone suddenly decided that all the things in the world were inert, and the only people who had agency and so on were humans. The only beings who had agency or any kind of historical rationality or whatever, these were humans. But by which they actually meant only sort of elite white men, white European men, because they didn't even think that white women had that kind of rationality. But so, once you realize what a terrible error this was, and it's the earth itself telling us what a terrible error this was, because increasingly we can see that the earth is Gaia. It has some sort of anima or spirit, which is what James Lovelock claimed. So then you begin to see that actually it's not just the earth. There are so many kinds of beings on the earth which have some kind of agency, if you like. I know that economists aren't allowed to say this, historians aren't allowed to say this, journalists aren't allowed to say it, and I often get flack from reviewers for actually saying this. But I'm a novelist. I get to say this.
Even in a non-fiction book.
Yes. I think writers, novelists, poets, we have a unique license to make these claims. And if we don't do it, who will?
Bravo.
Thank you.
I want to go back to not so much the beginning of the book, but where you start explaining the complete transformation of the eastern part of India when the opium production started, because in many ways, until I read this, I don't really think I understood the scale. You're talking about 1 million households. We're looking at 5 to 7 million people who are involved in this opium production. And just describe the kinds of people who were taken on to do this for the British?
Sure. So the British set up this thing called the Opium Department, and it emerges slowly from 1763 onwards.
Imagine that, the Opium Department.
Yes.
It's just extraordinary.
And it's finally sort of completed in 1799, and it has these two parts, each of which is centered on a factory. So one part is centered on the Patna factory, and the other part is centered on the Ghazipur factory, which you've seen. And between them, they control the entire central area of the Indo-Gangetic Plain. This is a huge region. It's the most populous part of India. And historically, it was one of the richest, most productive parts of India. All the great Indian empires were came out of this region. But today, we think of it as the poorest, most abject part of India, with all the worst indicators, economic indicators, educational indicators. And essentially, all of it can be traced back to what you might call the resource curse. So the Opium Department, which set up the cultivation of opium in this region, was really basically a sort of, how shall I say, it was like a kingdom within an empire. Its agents had absolute power. It had these paramilitary forces which had every kind of police power to police the lives of these peasants. So there was an incredible amount of surveillance involved, because opium, after all, is being produced. It's a very, very lucrative substance, but it's being produced by poor peasants who are always, laboring under the temptation to keep some for themselves and to sell it on the black market. So they have, it becomes more and more draconian. There's more and more pressure on the poor peasants to sort of meet quotas which the Opium Department sets up for them. And, it was a kind of, really, if you look back on it, it's a kind of horrific thing, because these peasants were producing this opium below cost. They were literally forced to produce this opium below cost. And this is at a time when, the British Empire is talking a lot about free trade and, free markets and so on. And at the same time, it's really producing this opium with forced labor.
You talk about it in the book, saying that this wasn't the free market. This was founded in colonialism and race, what Cedric J. Robinson called racial capitalism. And it's when you start to make those sorts of connections that it's quite clear that everything that happened from the 17th century onwards has left its residue, and the legacy of it is still present, or it repeats itself in different ways, and that there is a direct connection between what you are describing and the kind of global capitalism that we see today.
It's absolutely true. See, I think in liberal ideology would like to pretend that you can pass a law or make some sort of declaration, or and that that sets everything right. So that the granting of independence to India, okay, now you turn over a page and that's all done, or the end of slavery, and that chapter is closed, and let's go ahead. But as we can see, as so many American historians have shown, the legacies of slavery are very much with us. They've never gone away. In fact, modernity itself is completely marked with these legacies, even in modes of production and so on. So in the same way, this manner of producing opium left a very deep impact. It had a very deep impact across Eastern India. Because the people of Eastern India weren't allowed to trade in opium. It was a completely monopolistic trade, managed first by the East India Company, and then after the abolition of the East India Company by the British Raj. Now, the opium trade in Western India developed in a completely different direction.
This is what you were talking about earlier, Malwa, when it moved yes. to the West, and there was resistance.
That's right.
Yeah.
Because in Western India, unlike Eastern India, there were some very powerful indigenous states, and they resisted, and the British never completely succeeded in conquering them. So what they did was that they created indigenous networks of opium production, and these worked in a completely different way. Much of the revenue, much of the income that came from opium actually trickled down to to the peasants. So a peasant in Western India producing opium would earn 3 or 4 times as much as a peasant in Eastern India. So all the sort of trade and commercial networks of Western India profited hugely from opium. In fact, in one way or another, you can trace any old Indian business back to the opium trade in one way or another. What had happened is that it created a lot of capital, in Western India, and I think you can see the difference to this day.
In terms of the contrast between Bombay and Calcutta, for instance.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. As I say in the book, Bombay got the economy and Calcutta got the economists.
They love you for saying that.
Which was not a good trade-off.
No, absolutely not. I mean, and the kind of remnants of empire and colonial architecture and so on is still present in Calcutta in a way that you've got these skyscrapers in Bombay, and I'm glad that we refuse to call it Mumbai. So I just want to go back to the structure of the opium department, because the opium agent, as you just explained to us, was this incredibly powerful figure. And this book is not a kind of standard history. It feels to me like it's a dialogue with the past. It's also a commentary on the present, but it is also a chronicling of the art history, as you've just very, very briefly told us about. I want to just dwell on that a little bit, because I think it's just so, it makes the book something kind of head and shoulders above a kind of conventional history of the period that you've chosen. And it isn't just the hidden history of opium in that, it becomes a hidden history of the art history that surrounds opium. So tell us a little bit about the research that was involved for you in trying to figure out how much documentation there was about the kinds of people who worked in the opium department, how it was depicted, and some of the literary figures that you have also written about. I mean, briefly, but there are pretty big names that you encounter who are connected to all of this.
Yes, sure. So the opium department, there was a man called the opium agent who would be the sort of, as it were, the CEO of one section of the opium department, and he would have another CEO in the other part. And these were very, very grand people. They had the biggest salaries in the colonial administration. They made enormous amounts of money. And they lived very, very grandly. I mean, they would travel around, the opium department's territories with 10,000 people in attendance on them. So it was a very coveted position. But the interesting thing about the opium department was that, unlike other aspects of the British bureaucracy, they would take in, various kinds of office staff without examinations. So it became a favorite way of finding employment for unemployed young white men. If you were not very prosperous white person in India at that time, and you had all these sons that you couldn't afford to educate, you'd put them in the opium department where they did very well. But also, they had all kinds of really unexpected people, like, for example, George Orwell's father. George Orwell's original name was Eric Blair, and he was born actually on an opium station in Motihari in Bihar. And his father was an opium agent, who spent his whole life in the opium department. And, George Orwell was obviously very well informed about all of this, and he probably smoked opium when he was in Burma. And so that's just one. Rudyard Kipling, his sort of godfather was a man called the Sir Henry Rivet Carnac, who was a baronet who ran the opium department. And he was a great sort of patron of Kipling and his father. And Kipling visited the Ghazipur opium factory and wrote an article about it. And it's really kind of, I analyzed the article in the book, where this whole thing, he writes about it as we see so often. Colonial discourse tends to be always written in the passive voice. So, here he comes to this thing, this opium factory exists, it's producing enormous quantities of opium for the British Empire. Never once does he mention that it was the British Empire that sets it up. And it's all because of the Chinese, blame the Chinese,
Blame the demand
from
the Chinese. I mean, that's the other thing. We'll talk about that in a second. Yeah. Sorry to interrupt you.
So, that's Kipling. Then Rabindranath Tagore. He had a relative who worked in the opium department, and he actually spent 6 months in Ghazipur soon after his marriage, and he took a 6-month-old child there, and his whole family came to visit, but they never visited the opium factory. His sisters actually left a very beautiful account of their time in Ghazipur. But they looked at everything else, but they never entered the opium factory, because I think Rabindranath Tagore's grandfather was actually a very, very big merchant and opium trader. He traded in many things, but opium was certainly one of them. And, Tagore, this was a lasting memory for Tagore. I mean, he never forgave his grandfather. And through his entire life, he was one of those people who just unrelentingly denounced the opium trade. And that was the basis of his also wanting to create, a friendly space for China inside India, which he did.
Mm. I mean, the lack of the two things, the documents that you've mentioned, the Kipling description and the Rivet Karnak diaries and so on. I mean, most of the material, the documents are in English, and you didn't really find anything in either Hindi or Bhojpuri either.
Nothing. There's nothing in Hindi or Bhojpuri, really. There's no documentation of this at all, which is why the pictures are so important, because they give you an idea of the Indian perspective on this, which you don't get at all from, all the colonial records. But there again is the curious thing that inasmuch as we have any pictorial documentation, it comes from company artists. There's no documentation of opium production in Western India, for example.
That's so interesting. Yeah. I mean, you also make that connection when you pointed out the Piranesi picture as well. And in the book, you talk about how Arthur Sackler, who, of course, the famous Sackler family and their connection with opioids and so on, that he put together an exhibition of Piranesi. Was that one of the first kind of exhibitions that he put on?
Sackler was completely obsessed with Piranesi.
Yeah.
You know, it's one of those bizarre sorts of uncanny connections that you see through this whole thing. Arthur Sackler was also a great Sinophile. And he amassed this huge collection of Chinese art. If any of you have seen the Hulu documentary on the Sacklers,
yeah.
You'll notice that they're very accurate about this. They present all the Chinese art that there was, in those spaces.
Or Empire of Pain, Patrick Radden Keefe's book.
Yes,
yeah.
Yes, absolutely, yes. So the biggest exhibition that Sackler had of his paintings was actually at the Low Library at Columbia. And the Low Library is itself named after one of the most important American opium traders, Abbott Lowe.
Abbott Lowe, yeah.
Yes, I mean, Columbia people didn't know this. They asked me to go and talk to them about it.
I was in the audience that day.
Yes, you were, that's right.
So let's move on to the American connection, because the book is fascinating on the Canton graduates, as they were known. So explain the American connection in terms of the opium trade, how they got involved, and also what they did with the money when they came back, because there are continuing resonances with contemporary society there too.
Very much so. So until 1783, Americans were forbidden to trade with China. They couldn't trade with China because all trade with China was a monopoly of the East India Company. And that was why you had, for example, the Boston Tea Party and so on, because the East India Company was selling Chinese tea at a big markup, which created a lot of resentment and so on. Now, in 1783, what happened is that you have this very young nation with a very small economy in relation to the British economy, and they look around and they're surrounded by British colonies that they can't trade with. So they decide, who do we trade with? And the obvious answer was China. So literally within weeks of the British fleets leaving New York, the first American ship set off for China. It was called the Empress of China, and it made a very good return on investment, 25%. It was actually financed by Philadelphia merchants. But once that happened, the dam broke, and Americans began to race to China to try and find some sort of commodity of trade with China. It's actually reckoned, that in the 19th century, through much of the 19th century, especially in the port cities, the major port cities, which are all the most important cities in the US, 10% of the goods in any household, whether rich or poor, would be things made in China, porcelain, etc. And also often all kinds of goods made from cotton, but also iron and so on and so forth. So, but the problem for the Americans was the same as the problem for the British. They didn't actually have anything that the Chinese wanted. So they couldn't trade with China. I mean, first they tried with ginseng, and they did, but the market for ginseng is not very elastic. Then they tried furs, which is how John Jacob Astor got into it, because he was the great fur merchant. He actually founded Astoria in Washington State in order to trade with China. But then again, the market for furs isn't that elastic. Then they tried sea cucumbers, sandalwood, and all these things. But finally, they had no option. They had to turn to opium. And being American, they were very pioneering and creative. So they went off to Turkey and found a new source of opium, and they became the great pioneers of taking Turkish opium to China. But again, for a while, they were shut out of the Indian opium trade, but after the War of 1812, beginning 1815, they were able to enter the Indian opium trade. Many American business houses set up agencies in Bombay especially, but also in Calcutta. So they got very much involved in this. Now, what is really interesting about this is that the Americans who got involved in the China trade, and especially in opium, were a very small group. They were a very small, tightly knit group of northeastern people, mainly based all based basically in New England, except for a few from New York. Mainly they were based in Boston, And it was a very small group of interconnected families, Cabots, Lodges, Perkinses, and most of all, most notably, the Delanos. So Andrew Delano was one of the most important opium traders in China in the mid-19th century. And Andrew Delano's daughter was the mother of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And that's where all the Roosevelt money came from. It came from, not from the Roosevelt side, but from the Delano side. The Delanos were a very old New England family, going back almost to the Mayfair. Essentially, the entire group of people who were known as Boston Brahmins were basically opium traders. And they were very closely linked to each other. They made vast fortunes in China through dealing in opium. The Russells, the Forbes family, which is almost iconic of American capitalism itself. So the interesting part of it is that these guys would go out to China when they were 16, 17, 18 sometimes. One of the biggest, most successful opium traders was a man called John Cushing, who went out as a 16-year-old boy. And he was basically adopted by a very famous Chinese trader called Wu Bunjiang, who was known as Hao Kwa, who was then probably the richest man in the world. And he made Cushing incredibly wealthy. So Cushing came back to America as one of the richest men in the whole country, and a great catch because he wasn't married. These guys came back. They were in their 20s usually. They had all this money, and often Chinese traders would give them money to invest in America. So being in Canton for them was incredibly important because they learned about currencies, they learned about international trade, they learned about all the industries that were then coming up in Europe, and they invested all their money in this stuff. So the earliest railway companies were financed with opium money. Many banks were financed with opium money, but most of all, these guys were also great philanthropists. So they gave lots and lots of money to universities and to schools, and your Princeton, its School of Engineering, was set up with opium money.
Nothing to do with it. Nothing to do with it.
The Law Library, as I said. But really, I mean, I just was at Brown University. The Brown family, if there's a plaque which admits that this family was a slave trading family, but also it says the China trade. Now, the China trade.
Yeah, what is that? The China trade.
Yeah, it's like calling the Andean cocaine trade. You might as well call it the Andes trade or whatever. It's just a kind of absurdity. They were just trading in opium.
And yet there is something interesting that the Americans have done that the British have not, which is that the trade in China has a place in American memory in a way that it doesn't in the UK, or not quite as centrally, perhaps.
That is absolutely true. I mean, American historians have produced extensive documentation of where the opium money went, what these families did. New books are appearing every year, and it's been extensively documented, which it hasn't been in the case of the United Kingdom, which has actually profited much, much more.
How do you account for that?
I don't know, really. I think it's because the American economy was a smaller economy. The opium money actually had a much bigger impact here. So it's easier, in a sense, it's more visible, it's easier to trace. But apart from that, I think the British are just not interested in tracing this, I mean, they wouldn't have been interested in looking into the history of slavery if they did not have such a large domestic constituency, that was pressing for it. Yeah. That constituency doesn't exist in relation to opium, but maybe one day it'll happen.
And the impact, of course, on India and the Indians who worked for the factory is chronicled by you extensively, and you've talked about it already. But also on the Chinese, I mean, just completely disastrous in terms of the addiction. I wonder about the addiction domestically, though, in India. Can you talk a little about that? Because you alluded to it a little when you were talking about Indians who were paid so badly, but sometimes there was a suggestion that they might want to make some extra money for themselves and profiteering from it, but there was so much surveillance, it was very hard for them to do that. But to what extent did Indians become addicted to opium?
Addiction became a very big problem in India, so that by 1947 it was a really, really major problem. It varied from region to region, but in Assam, for example, people say that the addiction rates could have been as high as 50%. So there was a very major addiction problem in India as well. And what happens is when you have enormous quantities of opium circulating, some of it will always pass into the hands of underground networks who then go on to sort of distribute it. But for historical reasons, the addiction problem in India was never as bad as it was in China. And that's largely because in India, when opium was taken, it was generally taken as a tonic. It was eaten or it was drunk. And this was quite common even within my lifetime, in my grandparents' generation, it was quite common to take an opium pill. Much as I suppose it's common here for people to take cough suppressants or whatever, which also have, some opioid content. But in China, it was a completely different case, where China, because people smoked opium, it was a much more addictive form of, consumption. And it was much worse, much worse for the health and so on. So China really, by 1900, was facing enormous problems because of opium addiction. Now, nobody knows exactly how many addicts existed in China, and it's important to note that not everyone who took opium was an addict, just as not everyone who takes OxyContin is an addict. In fact, it's a tiny minority who are addicts. But as you know here, within 6 years of the introduction of OxyContin, opioid deaths became the leading cause of death. So China too was facing an absolutely disastrous situation, in the late 19th, early 20th century. But they stuck with it, and slowly, a mass movement arose, an anti-opium movement. It's a grassroots movement, often spearheaded by women. And they finally, this movement was a worldwide movement, and it finally managed to bring the big empires, under control in some way.
This is a subject that you've lived with in a different way through your fiction and now this book for many, many years. I want to ask you about the impact on you, because this is a really difficult history to absorb and to live with, let alone, sharing it with the world and reminding people of how vile it was and base.
Yeah, it was terrible. I mean, I had a lot of research that I did for the Ibis trilogy, so I had a mountain of material. But it's different when you're writing fiction. In fiction, you can make it pleasurable for yourself, because you experience it through your characters. You can make it funny in parts. You can experience it in many different ways. But I did have this enormous amount of material, and I thought I should do something with it. So after I'd finished writing the Ibis trilogy, I thought, it was actually my wife who encouraged me. She said, you should do a nonfiction book with this. So I wrote up a proposal, and I got an advance and everything. And I sat down and started writing it. And, after about 6 months, I thought to myself, I can't live with this. This is just too grim. It's just too horrible. So I actually, I ended my contracts, I returned the advances, and I thought, there, I'm done with that. And then I moved on to other things. But then, the material was still there. And I think after writing my books, The Great Derangement and The Nutmeg's Curse, I came back to this because I felt that it's a story that needs to be told, because it's a kind of parable of, what's happened to the modern world, in a sense. Just for the sake of profit, this is actually what the Chinese said in the 19th century. For the sake of profit, you're willing to destroy the lives of millions of people.
And you continue to make the connections with what's happening today. You don't actually think that very much has changed. I mean, it manifests itself somewhat differently. You don't have indentured labourers now in quite the same way, but you are quite clear in the book that the stain of that history has bled into what we see today.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you just think about these giant energy corporations, which knew how much damage they were doing to the global environment, they financed the research, and then they suppressed it, as we know. But it was again, it was the big European empires, which were then the sponsors of the opium industry, which actually invented the playbooks of what we now call denial, which is, blame the user, blame the demand. They invented all these playbooks, which were later adopted by the tobacco industry, and as Naomi Oreskes has shown, was then adopted by energy corporations. So there's a clear and direct line.
I have more questions, but I'm going to open it up to the audience. I wonder if we could have the house lights on.
Yes, could we?
And there are microphones that are roving. There's a hand that's gone up right there in the middle.
The Ibis trilogy, combined with this book, really do describe these vast rivers of opium moving from Western India and from Eastern India into the Pearl River Basin and Canton very, very clearly. But as you describe them in these two remarkable groups of written material, it's difficult for me to feel exactly how opium becomes monetized, because so much of the opium was smuggled because the emperor rules prohibited, direct sales from these merchants in these protected areas near Canton. So they had to be smuggled by these, as you've described them, these crabbers, these little boats with oars that rowed very fast and escaped, military authorities. But in that respect, how did the opium actually penetrate China and get converted into cash, and that cash reverted to those merchants and affect the balance of payments, essentially, as you've described it?
That's a very good question. So I should explain that what happened is that the Qing dynasty understood very early that opium could be a real problem, because they were hearing back from Chinese merchants in Java, who were sending them very detailed descriptions of how the Dutch had used opium in the Dutch East Indies. So the emperor actually banned the opium trade as early as 1729. So ever after that, the trade was completely a criminal trade. So this was a big problem for the East India Company, because the East India Company was very dependent on its tea revenues. It had to keep on buying tea in China. It couldn't afford to antagonize the Qing government. At the same time, it needed to send its opium in order to get the silver to trade for Chinese tea. So they came up with this absolutely ingenious subterfuge, which was that they would auction the opium to various private merchants in Calcutta, and then they would say, they would wash their hands off it. They would say, this is theirs. These are the private traders. They're free traders. They can go and trade wherever they like. So these traders would go up to the sort of doorway of China. It's actually in the basin of the Pearl River, between sort of Macau and Hong Kong. There's an island called Lintin, And actually, it was a young Forbes who came up with this brilliant idea. So what they did is that they anchored all these vessels there. They were called hulks because they didn't have masts. So they would go there. They would offload all their opium onto these vessels. So Chinese wholesalers, smugglers and so on, would come onto these vessels. They would buy the opium for silver. And, the merchants would then have all the silver on their hands. And then they would go further up the Pearl River to the customs points, And once they got to the customs points, they would just say, opium? What opium? We don't have any. Our holds are empty. We don't have anything. We've come here to buy tea. So it was this sort of ingenious subterfuge that served for a very long time. And the thing about opium is, it's again one of the continuities we see in the sort of circulation of opium. Once opium begins to circulate, it has this almost uncanny power of undermining structures of governance, of creating these massive, how shall I say, networks of corruption. As you know, this has happened in America now. It's happened in Europe, it's happened in America. I mean, it has. I mean, the really terrible thing about this opioid crisis that started, with Purdue Pharma, is that it completely undermined trust in the most trusted institutions of rural America. Your doctor, your pharmacist, your nurse. So this again is a sort of uncanny replay of what happened in China in the 19th century. And as I argue in the book, in many ways, what America is living through today is really a sort of uncanny, how shall I say, reflection of what China lived through in the 19th century. That is, opium entered, it sort of entered through portals created by other challenges until it became, as it were, a civilizational challenge.
Hello. Thank you so much. That was really a wonderful session, and I just want to preface my question by saying that your work has been so important for so many people, and especially those of us who are academics like myself and studying post-colonial, writing about post-colonialism and its many histories. And so, the point about connections is so important because that is something that you do really uniquely well, and sort of exposing racial capitalism and how it's connected to colonialism, settler colonialism, and so on, and histories of slavery and so on. So my question, and this is not a hostile question, but I really isn't, because I love your work. And so the question comes out of, I actually hadn't known about this until fairly recently, but that you had accepted a prize in 2007, given to you at Tel Aviv University, and when you were criticized for that by people, who really admired your work, and that you did not make the connection between Israel's settler colonialism and the prize that you were receiving from that state. And you explained your reaction, an acceptance of the prize by saying that there was no connection because it was a private university. You were not really getting it from the Israeli state. But the fact is, Tel Aviv was built on a village that was razed to the ground, and the Palestinians were ejected from that, right? Sheikh Mohannes. Tel Aviv at that time had at least 55 technological projects with the IDF.
So up until now, you've made several statements. So what's the question?
So that is my question: is that have you rethought your position given what's happening? Because your work is so morally, politically important, and do you see the connections that perhaps at that time you did not want to talk about? I'm just curious if you've had any sort of change of heart on that particular topic. Thank you so much.
To be honest, no, I don't think I've had a change of heart. I think in relation to any particular society, any particular place, you have to you have to be discriminating, as it were. You can't lump everything together. I mean, as Rashid Khalidi said the other day, would anyone be justified in coming and throwing a projectile at his house because he's part of a settler colonial society? No, of course not. I mean, under those circumstances, would I be able to actually go to Columbia University or any other university, all of which have been built upon land that has been seized from Native Americans? Delhi University, where I studied, was basically seized from, the local peasantry. That's also true of Jawaharlal Nehru University. And that actually happened in my lifetime. So I do think that one has to keep some sorts of, some sorts of bridges open. How can you just sort of, in a blanket sense, say, that I will have nothing to do with an entire society where I have many readers, I have many readers there. So how can I just say no? And I think this has become a real problem, that nobody wants to talk to anybody any longer nowadays,
I don't know where the microphone is, but there's a hand just here in the middle. Very hard for me to see with the lights straight in my eye. Thank you.
So given all, can you hear me? So given all the uncomfortable truths that your book exposes.
Sorry, can you hold the microphone?
Sorry.
I think it's omnidirectional, so you point it directly
so
in your mouth.
Given
like
all
that.
the uncomfortable truths that your book exposes, I'm wondering whether you've seen any difference in the way that it's either reviewed or discussed, depending on where you are, India, the UK, or here.
I generally try not to read reviews because it can be so depressing. And I think you just have to learn to protect yourself a little bit. So instead, my publishers send me little quotes from some reviews, and I get the sense, oh, this is a good review, so I'll, I'll put it on social media or something like that. But this book certainly has been extremely it's been read, shall I say, with great interest in India. And I get the sense that it's been also being read with great interest in Britain and here. I just came, the book was launched in Britain, like about 2 weeks ago. And it got amazing reviews, even in the Telegraph, which amazed me. So.
Even in the Telegram. Oh, great. Okay.
Where? Yes.
Go ahead.
Hi, thank you. About the East versus West Indian connection in the two economies, I'm wondering if your book goes further west, to Pakistan, to Afghanistan, where the current opioid crisis as well as the opium belt exists. Having covered the war in Afghanistan and Pakistan over the last 2 decades, as a journalist and a once proud graduate of Columbia, clearly that's dwindling fast thanks to your research. The war hasn't managed to fight the opium factories there. And I'm wondering if your book manages to go that further west and also figure out the contemporary crisis as far as its connections in the war on terror, the Taliban, all of that is concerned, because that at that point was also part of India. So I'm wondering why you stop at Bombay. I hope you don't. I'm looking forward to the book, but I'm wondering if you can explain the further westernization of opium growth, if you know anything about it.
Sure. See, that's a sort of interesting history. What actually happens is that, as I was saying, the principalities and the sort of merchant networks of Western India constantly tried to evade British control, and they kept exporting opium from various ports along the west coast of India. One of the most important ports at that point was Karachi. And one of the reasons why the British invaded Sindh and conquered Sindh was precisely in order to take over Karachi and to shut it down to the opium trade. The British decided that all the opium from Western India was going to go through Bombay because they levied very heavy taxes on it, and they earned a lot of money from the taxes on opium. So they basically shut down the opium trade in Pakistan altogether. I mean, what is now Pakistan altogether. So it was never a really big industry in that region, at least within the colonial times. Now, again, this is the thing about opium. Opium has historically, since the 19th century onwards, been used by insurgent groups, because it's a very cheap source of income. And that's what actually happened in Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, it started happening in the 80s onwards. And in Pakistan now, as you may know, the Taliban had actually shut down the opium production completely in every part of Afghanistan, with the exception of Badakhshan, which is, under the was under the Northern Alliance. But that production has been completely substituted by Pakistan now. So there's been a huge surge in opium production in Pakistan, but also in some parts of India. So, basically, Pakistan and India are living through a really major opioid crisis right now. It passes unnoticed most of the time, but if you look at, say, for example, Punjabi serials on television, almost all of them are about opium, And again, in northeastern India, it's become a very major problem. Actually, opium is behind the destabilization of Manipur, for example.
A hand just up there. Oh, sorry, go ahead, yeah. And then up there.
You've written about the climate crisis as well as about the continuing opium crisis. Do you see lessons in your analysis of the opium crisis that we could use in combating the climate crisis?
Yes, absolutely, I do. Because see, what happened with the opium trade is that in the late 19th century, a huge, global movement emerged. It brought together religious groups of various kinds, missionary groups, but also many activist groups, women's groups in India. Many of the early Indian nationalists were actually opium activists, like Dadabhai Nauroji, who was a founding member of the Indian National Congress and so on. Tagore was a very important voice. So, they created a transnational movement which was ultimately able to create reputational damage for those who dealt with opium. And I think it's possible today, again, to build a transnational movement of this kind, by bringing together groups of many different sorts, which actually don't agree on anything other than one thing, which is like shutting down fossil fuels and creating reputational damage for fossil fuels. And this is, in fact, the strategy adopted by, let's say, 350.org and so on. So I think I think that movement could have legs. And I think they can look to the anti-opium movement of the late 19th century as a source of inspiration. Unfortunately, that I think will not happen, though. I mean, I don't think they will look to the anti-opium movement, because the idea of, how shall I say, limiting drug consumption is something quite which many liberal groups will treat as anathema.
Up there, the lady, no, I think it's...
You've written multiple books around the opium topic. I have no idea, of course, how you pick themes to explore, but I wonder, is there another broad theme that you intend to get into in the years to come and write multiple books on? And if there is or if there's not, just some perspective on how you develop these arenas that you explore through multiple books.
Well, to cut a long story short, I would say that I'm really done with nonfiction. I've had enough of it. I just want to go back to writing fiction again. And
you did say that about this book when you put it to one side, though.
I did.
And then you went back.
I did. And I may very well go back again because, I think I still have lots of things to say about, especially the climate crisis and, the way in which it's represented in the West and, the differences between, let's say, the global South and the global North in their responses to the climate crisis. I think there's a lot to be said there, so maybe I will go back to it at a certain point.
I think we've got time for maybe a couple more questions, as long as they're shortish. Okay, great. So that one up there and then one down here.
I'll take the risk of mentioning a Californian author that may not be a pleasure to your ears, but I'm interested in your reflections on his work in relation to yours. And what I'm referring to specifically is I'm thinking of Michael Pollan's work on opium in the Botany of Desire, and the connection that I heard in your discourse earlier, and in Pollan's book when I was teaching it, is his sense of the opium poppy as an incredibly powerful agent in and of itself. And this, I might say, was well before what's called the new materialism existed as a sort of a discourse. And you too, in your description of the poppy, refer to it not only as an agent, but there's a certain something there that is it seductive? Is it's radical alteration of consciousness? It's a haunting, and Pollan suggests that as well. I'm just simply interested in whether you have any reflections on that question.
Thank you. That's a very interesting question. I really admire Michael Pollan's work. I think it's very interesting and important work, and yeah, I'm completely in tune with him on these subjects. Absolutely.
Final question down here. Somebody got the microphone here? Was there a hand up here? Maybe I'm imagining it.
There's a hand back there.
I have to ask this for the record.
Oh my God, you get a second question?
Yes. Have you
That's
tried
so
opium?
cheeky.
Have you tried opium? It's a
No, I
serious
didn't
question.
hear it, sorry.
I had to ask this for the record. During your research and writing, have you tried opium?
Excellent question on which to end. Go ahead.
People always ask me this, and what I always say is that we've all tried opium. I mean, we're all really big. I mean, if you've ever had an anesthetic, if you've ever had an operation, I mean, I don't know how many of you have ever had one of those, what do they call them? Those, when they do the spleen thing, or, what is it? I'm forgetting the name.
What, colonoscopy?
Colonoscopy, yes.
Nothing to do with the spleen whatsoever.
I'm terrible on all things anatomical. But, a colonoscopy is a terrible, terrible, awful thing. But when you come out of it, you feel strangely exhilarated. because you've been given some opium.
Wonderfully deflected. He doesn't deflect at all in this book. I always say this at book events. This is an astonishing book. I tend not to do book events with people that I think I won't like the book or I won't think anything of it. Buy the book, read it, buy a second one, give it to somebody else. It's astonishing. He's astonishing. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Razia. Thank you.